This morning we are looking, we're continuing to look at Mark, the Gospel of Mark, as we kind of are on this road to Easter. Easter's really early this year, April 1st. Mark your calendars. It's really early. It's coming soon. We are in Mark chapter 2 at the very end, and we're going to look into the first part of Mark chapter 3. So Mark chapter 2, verse 23 through Mark chapter 3, verse 6. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some of the heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.' Another time he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them, 'Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill?' But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. He said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus." So we're in Mark, the very first part of chapter 3, and already, there are groups of people who are so unhappy with him that they're conspiring together for how they might put an end to this troublemaker. Well, let's look more closely at this text. I wanted to read the whole thing together, but we're going to go back and look at each one of these stories, each one of these two stories, a little closer to see what's really going on in these stories that we might miss in just our plain and simple reading. Sometimes we'll read through a story, and because of our culture, we are almost 2,000 years removed from the culture of the day, and because of our religious convictions, we are Christians, and the people in this story were first century Jews, we may miss some things in what's being said and what's being done and what's being talked about. And it might be really easy, really tempting for us to look at the story and say, "Oh, well, those people, they didn't get it right. I would have gotten it right if I were there." Maybe, but maybe not. So let's look more closely at these two stories. Jesus and his disciples are walking through a grain field on the Sabbath day. And as they're going along, his disciples, they just pick off the heads of grain and they rub it between their hands and they eat the grain raw and unprocessed, which, I don't know if you've ever had just wheat berries that have just been picked. It will do the job, but we're not talking about a gourmet meal. They didn't stop, they didn't grind it, they didn't make it into flour, they didn't make that flour into cakes or bread and cook it over a flame, they didn't start a fire. There was a lot of things they didn't do, but this thing that they did do, by picking these heads of grain, by rubbing them together to get off the chaff and the other stuff, and eating those those grains, was something that those who were observing were not happy with. They were not happy with this action of picking these heads of grain. So they say to Jesus, "Look at your disciples. Why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Now notice, they didn't say, "Why are you doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath?" Because apparently Jesus was not picking these heads of grain. But why are your disciples over there? Why are they over there breaking the Sabbath if you're so holy? Isn't that what we like to do? We wouldn't say it. We would never admit it. But when somebody is in a position of authority, when somebody is in a high position, when they're kind of gaining traction and maybe we're not, don't we start looking? We start looking for the flaws. We start looking for the thing that we can maybe, oh, they're not so hot after all. It's what we do. That's why tabloids are in business, right? We love to read stories, salacious stories about people who are popular, people who are powerful, people who are in the public eye. So here's Jesus and his disciples, and they're picking these heads, and they say to Jesus, why are they doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath? Let's look so that we know what the Bible says about the Sabbath. So this is in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. This comes straight from the Ten Commandments. Here's what the Bible says about the Sabbath. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, not your ox or your donkey or any of your animals, nor the alien within your gates, so that your manservant and maidservant may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. It's a very good principle, but it's not very specific. It's not very specific, is it? And so, because it's broad, because it's a principle and not a list of rules, I mean, there are a couple of things that are prohibited, right? Don't do work. Not you, not your kids, not your people that you employ. Don't do work. Well, what is work? That's a very good question. What is work? It's a question that, in order to try to be as faithful as possible to the text, people started almost immediately writing their own rules for what was work and what was not. Now, they didn't do this out of rebellion. They didn't do this to try to be in control of their own lives. They didn't try to do this to flout God. They did it because they wanted to be faithful. They did it because they wanted to be faithful. And so they said, we don't exactly know what work is. God didn't tell us. So we're going to try to figure this out for ourselves. What is work? What is work? And by the time of Jesus, there were lists, really long lists, scrolls and scrolls of rules, depending on the sect, depending on who you were following, the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the Essenes, what your rules were for the Sabbath. They had things like, how many steps or paces can you walk on the Sabbath? It included things like, could you carry something on the Sabbath? And if you could carry something, how much could you carry? And for what purpose could you carry that thing? A mother, of course, could carry her baby. You know, it's got to be able to do that. But if you were carrying a burden, you couldn't carry it. You couldn't kindle a fire. You couldn't light a candle. There were all kinds of rules for what it meant to not do work on the Sabbath. So as Jesus is walking through this grain field with his disciples, and the Pharisees say to him, look, why are they doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath? They were saying those disciples are doing what? Working. What kind of work? They are harvesting, of course. You ever seen a harvester pick 5 heads of grain? Nope. Not the human harvester and not the machine harvester. Have you ever seen somebody prepare a meal by simply rubbing off the chaff? Because that was a second thing, right? Not only did they harvest it, but they prepared a meal for themselves. I've never seen anybody hungry enough to just pick raw heads of wheat and eat it because they were hungry. Maybe because they were curious. Maybe because they wanted to see, maybe they could tell the moisture level. Maybe they could tell how good the crop was by tasting it. A farmer might be able to do that. But I've never seen somebody so hungry that they would walk through a field and pick the heads of grain and just rub it off and eat the raw wheat. I bet they were hungry. I bet they were really hungry. I think you'd have to be pretty motivated to do what they were doing. So they were saying, your disciples are harvesting and they're preparing food, therefore they are doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath. And Jesus points to another story. He points to another story that all of them would have known, because as Pharisees, they would have been experts in the law, experts in the scripture, experts in their Jewish history. They would have known every story. So he points to another story that they all knew, and this story was also about some hungry guys. He says, okay, I see what you're saying. He didn't say, no, technically, they're not doing work, they're not harvesting. Technically, they're only eating enough to stay alive. He didn't say, no, they're not preparing food, they're eating food raw, which is, permissible on the Sabbath. I know they rubbed off the stuff. He didn't argue the law with them. He didn't argue point by point. He didn't argue technicality by technicality. He pointed them to a story. He said this, have you ever read, which I think is really funny, because these are experts in the law, and he starts with, have you ever read that story? That story about David, when he and his companions were hungry and in need. And they would have been thinking, right? So that story about David. So now they've got, you picture all of the shelves of books coming out, right? And they're like, aha, David. And they're pulling that off the shelf. And they're like, David was hungry. And so they're flipping through to the hungry indices in their memories. And he and his men were in need. And then he narrows it even further to the days of Abiathar the high priest. And that would have done it. They would have known. Before he even told the rest of the story, they would have known. They would have known what he was going to say. They would have known that they had lost. They lost the argument. In the days of Abiathar the high priest, not only did David and his men enter the house of God into the area where the priests were, they ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priests to eat. And so David did this, and so they might have just been able to excuse David. Well, he was a pretty important guy. We'll make allowances for him. But not only did he do that, he also gave some to his companions to eat as well. It's a big deal. It's a big, big deal what David did. It was a big law that David broke. And Jesus is saying, if he did that, why are you so upset about this? If he went all the way in to where the bread is kept, why are you mad about this? If he ate the bread on the altar, the consecrated bread, which was supposed to remain there all day, and then after sunset, then the priests could divide it up and eat it. But it was there as a show offering. It was there to be on display. He ate it. He gave it to his companions. They ate it. Why are you so mad at my disciples for feeding their bellies on the Sabbath? Why are you so mad? And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And what he's saying there is that the Sabbath is a blessing. The Sabbath is a blessing. What is that? Do you remember what it said at the end of that passage in Deuteronomy? It said, Remember that God brought you and your ancestors out of slavery in Egypt. Don't enslave yourselves again. Give yourselves a day off. Take a day off and rest, for goodness sakes. The Sabbath was made to be a blessing. It's not something for human beings to have to serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath is there to serve the human condition, which is that we need to rest from time to time. We have to rest. And so Jesus says, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Even of the Sabbath. Another time he went into the synagogue and a man with a shriveled hand was there. And what does it say? Some of them were already looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. They were already looking, how can we trip him up? How can we get him to stumble? How can we get him to show himself that he's just another one of these teachers? How can we get him to reveal himself as just a fly-by-night, flash in the pan, one-hit wonder? We'll trip him up. They were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, and so they watched him closely to see if he would heal this man with a shriveled hand on the Sabbath. They're watching, just in case Jesus goes over into a corner and goes, be healed. Right? Just in case he holds his robe up and is like, be healed. So what does Jesus do? Jesus knows. Okay? Jesus knows. He knows what they're up to. He can see. He can read their hearts. He knows what they're up to. So what does he do? He says, excuse me, sir, would you please stand in front of everyone? Would you please stand in front of everyone? Stand up in front of everyone, he says to the man with a shriveled hand. Jesus didn't heal in secret. He didn't do it behind closed doors. His message wasn't whispered behind hidden palms. Jesus was up front, and he said, stand up in front of everyone. They want to see so bad, we'll let them see. Jesus asked them, what is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill? But they remained silent. They remained silent because the truth is, this is an ongoing debate. This was an ongoing debate. It was then, it still is now. It's an ongoing debate. Where is the fine line? Where is the fine line in serving the Sabbath rule? Because there's this concept that is widespread in rabbinic Judaism that the preservation of life is the highest good. The preservation of life is the highest good. And they get this from Leviticus 18:5, which says, live by keeping the law. And they say if the scripture says live by keeping the law, then obviously we shouldn't make anybody die in order to keep the law. Preservation of life. And in today's rabbinic tradition, depending on which rabbi or which school of thought you follow, they draw the line in different places. If a surgery can wait until the day after the Sabbath, they might wait. But if your life is in danger, they'll treat you. Well, what does it mean to have your life in danger? Well, there are some conditions that are automatically considered to be having your life in danger. If you're a woman giving birth, if you're a newborn baby, if you have an eye infection, these are some of the things that they would say, automatically says, your life is in danger, you need treatment now, treat them. But there are other things. There are other things that fall on the other side of that line where they would say it can wait for tomorrow. It can wait for tomorrow. So as they're looking at this man with a shriveled hand, he's had a shriveled hand for a while now. His life is not immediately in danger. And so they didn't answer. They didn't answer his question when he said, is it better to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill on the Sabbath? They didn't answer because they would have disagreed amongst themselves where the line was. There was no consensus. And so Jesus makes this determination on his own. He says, obviously, it's better to heal. Obviously, it's better to restore. Obviously, it's better to do good, not evil, to save a life, to heal on the Sabbath. But first, he looks around at them with what? He looks around at them with anger and in great distress because of their stubborn hearts. And he says to the man, stretch out your hand. I think this is the only time that Jesus healed in anger. Stretch out your hand. Stretch out your hand. We're going to show them. Stretch out your hand. The man stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. And the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Because a man with a shriveled hand could work again, could provide for himself and his family again, could be a full member of society again. And what Jesus did, he did with the power of God, which shows that God was on his side. So they no longer have any theological arguments to throw at him. So when you have no more arguments, what do? You plot to kill him, of course. You can't beat him with words. We'll beat him with swords. When I read these stories, it makes me wonder if we aren't still suffering from some of the same conditions as these Pharisees. Makes me wonder if we have areas where we insist on our own way of interpreting the scriptures when another way may preserve life. I watched the movie Wonder this week with my family. Arabella had seen it at school and wanted us to all watch it together, and so we watched it together. And one of the teachers in the movie had this quote on their blackboard: if you have a choice between being right or being kind, choose kindness. If you have a choice between being right or being kind, choose kind. Choose kind. And I wonder if we do that well. I wonder if we do that well. I wonder if we, in our daily lives, as we encounter other people, if we are more intent on judging them and being right. It feels good to be right, doesn't it? Oh boy, it feels good to be right. I love being right. I'm a recovering addict from rightness. It feels really good to be right, to have the right answers to all of the questions. Makes us feel secure and safe. But sometimes we need to be vulnerable. Sometimes it means more and it makes more of a difference to be kind. Could this man's hand have waited until the next day to be healed? Sure, it could have. He's not going to die that day. Could have waited till the sun went down. Sabbath would have been over. We're not talking about necessarily even 24 hours. Could have been 6 or 7 or 8. Could he have waited? Sure he could. But why wait? Why wait to do good? Is there ever a bad time to do good? That's what Jesus is saying. That's what he's asking these people who are standing in front of him, looking closely to see if he's going to violate the Sabbath. Is there ever a bad time to do the right thing, to help someone and to be kind? It makes me wonder, these stories, do we keep people from Jesus and the gospel because of our rules? Do we keep them out there and we say, we'd really like for you to be able to come in, but first you gotta. First you gotta. First you gotta what? You gotta dress right. You gotta talk right. You gotta look right. You gotta agree with us about everything. No differences of opinion allowed. I think in our church, I think we do okay with this. But I think that Christianity broadly in our culture doesn't. I think we could stand to learn a few things by going back and checking our rules, going back and checking our judgment, going back and checking to see, are we insisting on this because we want to be right, or are we insisting on this because it is good and true? Where do we draw the lines? It's a question for us as the American church. It's a question for us as friends. It's a question for us in this church, and it's a question for us as individuals. Where are we drawing the lines? The lines that keep people out? Or are we drawing lines that include people? What are we doing? Where do we stand? Do we stand at Jesus' side and offer healing? Or do we stand on the side of the Pharisees and say, you can be healed, but only at the right time? Where do we stand? I can't answer that question for you. I wish I could. Here's a sermon with no answers. I have no answers for you because I don't know where you stand. I know where I want to stand. I want to stand by Jesus' side. I want to stand by Jesus and offer healing and offer grace and offer mercy. I want to stand by Jesus and say, it is more important to save a life than to kill. It's more important to do good than to follow the rules if it prohibits goodness. It's where I want to be. It's where my heart is. And that's where I'm going to be praying this week. God, help me to stand by Jesus' side. Maybe that could be our prayer, our corporate prayer together. God, help me stand by Jesus' side, not on the side of being always right and following the rules, but on the side of goodness and healing, of grace and mercy, of a truth that listens to the principle. Jesus wasn't about disobeying the Sabbath or throwing it out the window. Obeying the principle without getting bogged down in the nitty-gritty. I hope that you will join me in that prayer this week. I hope that you will join me in praying, God, help me to stand by Jesus' side. And begin to look, begin to ask, begin to maybe poke around in that place in your mind and your heart where you hold your own rules, because we all have our own rules. Nobody is without rules. We all have them. Can we poke around in those rules and ask some hard questions about where we stand? I hope so.